You know, it's interesting to me the degree to which people online are very passionately engaged in this Israeli-Palestinian crisis, even people, many people who are unaffected by it. I mean, technically unaffected. They're not involved in it, and they don't have friends or family members in Israel or in Gaza. And I'm certainly not saying that that's a bad thing. It's interesting to me, though, that it really does seem like this is a new hypermedia oriented, social media oriented experience, socio-cultural experience of war. This is a new type of war experience than we have had before. I mean, as a society, as a culture, globally, because this really, to my mind, is the first war that has really captured public attention and captured international public attention and American attention, frankly, since the quote unquote wars on terror, the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, which have concluded. And what's different about the Israeli-Palestinian crisis right now and this war that's raging in Gaza is that in the past, in these other wars, social media, not a big aspect of it. Most people were not even using iPhones much. You didn't have a lot of people who had iPhones really until the mid 2000s. Or I think I got mine in like 2014. And and so we had, with the 9/11 and with the war in Iraq and the war in Afghanistan, of course, there were people who had cameras and got some footage of some things. But it still felt removed. It still felt at a distance. So of course, we'd see movies about soldiers in Iraq or Afghanistan or 9/11, or we would see journalist footage, journalist teams who went in and videotaped. But that is not the same thing as what we have now with everyone having an iPhone and everyone being able to record their own footage and take their own pictures, and also with the kind of quick, widespread dissemination that, as you know, is available now. And then not only that, but we have many, many more people who are engaged in online activity and online forums and online conversations than was the case in the early 2000s when we were involved in 9/11, the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I understand that we had troops there for a long, long time, that this is something that went on for many years after. But I'm just saying it still did not have the kind of, I think, all-encompassing involvement of normal human beings across the world that you see with this situation now. And so the fact that we have that so many more people are plugged into social media and are regularly every day, multiple times a day, even going online and interacting with other regular people who are sharing images that they've received and disseminating other images and so forth, like the virality of it, but also just the widespread nature of it, and the fact that so many more people are now plugged in. I think that it is really having an effect on the way that people process war and process conflict. And I think that it is also forcing a lot more people to have to deal with up close and personal, on their phone or computer, what have you, images from other people who are dealing with things up close and personal. So you have people who, it's not just journalists disseminating images anymore. There's not that sense of distance, but now it's people who are actually being bombed, or people who are actually being terrorized, or people who are actually fleeing for their lives, who directly, in a personal way, are sending out images and messages to people across the world, and there's cross engagement and conversation and dialogue and all of that. And I think that it is bringing the horrible reality of war and conflict. It is bringing it home for people. And so, whereas in the past, most Americans were very disengaged, honestly, very disengaged from what was going on in Gaza and even what was going on in Israel, unless they had friends or family over there. Um, People were much, much less engaged. And when people would hear about, oh, this horrible terrorist attack occurring, or they would hear about, oh, there were this many people killed today in a bomb, or this many children, or what have you, it just, it just didn't really hit. But now it's hitting. It's really hitting home for people. And not only is it hitting home for people, but now because of social media and the fact that we have become so integrated with technological media culture and so plugged in, even in these artificial ways, and we can argue about the merits of that, but so plugged in to people across the world, I think that it is really causing people to have to come to terms much more with the reality of war. And I'm not saying, and so yes, of course, that creates, I think, a much greater sympathy toward each side when that side is suffering. So there were all of those videos that came out from the attacks, the October attacks in Israel, and it was horrific. And then what's going on in Gaza now? There are innocent people who are being killed. There are kids who are being killed. That happens in war, and it's very tragic and awful. But that's happening, and these images people are widely disseminating, and they have a real personal quality to it, and people are able to weigh in real time, which was something that wasn't available in these past wars. They're able to weigh in real time, and I just think that it is creating this interesting sort of feedback loop. And so I think that that's one reason why it seems like you have many more people engaged in these kinds of debates. I was thinking about how, for instance, in World War II, we killed hundreds of thousands, maybe even into the millions, but even conservative estimates, we killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of innocent Japanese civilians because we and the other allies, but we had a major part in that. We bombed the hell out of Japan. And I know also Germany got, bombed, and I know that the Allies took a lot, obviously Pearl Harbor and England, it took a lot of bombing. I'm not trying to say, oh, we're horrible. There's a different point that I'm trying to make here, though. I'm saying that most people, almost all at the time, felt like we were definitely justified in going over there and bombing Japan because they had attacked us first. They had Pearl Harbor, this horrible 9/11-like attack. It was that generation's 9/11. And so we felt very morally comfortable sending our guys over there to bomb the hell out of Japan. And even today, even though, yes, I know there's debate about the 2 atomic bombs that we dropped, even today, the overall consensus still seems to be that we did what we had to do and it was not immoral, and that the Japanese deserted it, they brought it on themselves. Here's what I'm trying to say, though. Like, even if one were to assume that we were on the morally righteous side in that, we still killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians and kids. And we were just able to shrug that off because it wasn't personalized for people back then. You didn't have all of these Japanese families going on Twitter and sending images of the aftermath of the atomic bombs, and it's not just the atomic bombs, by the way. It's all the other bombing we were doing. The atomic bombs together killed like a little over 100,000 people, which is horrible. But the other bombing that we did got into the hundreds and hundreds of thousands. We killed 100,000 people in Tokyo in just one night of bombing. And the bombing was so hardcore. Some of the things we engaged in back then today would not be permissible by modern standards of warfare. And some of the stuff we were doing was so brutal and was killing so many civilians that Curtis LeMay, who was one of our military guys who orchestrated these huge bombing campaigns in Japan, he made sort of a joke, that we better win this war because if we don't win it, we're going to be hanged for war crimes. And yet that's just something sort of other than a discussion of the atomic bomb. For the most part, people just see that as like, oh yeah, there was a lot of Japanese people that had to die because, you know. And I'm not saying that that's an incorrect estimation. I think, and I'll get to this in a moment, I think, as probably a lot of you do, that in life, when we get into these situations of conflict, that oftentimes what we're left with is just a a series of bad alternatives. That there is not some great answer or great alternative or great choice where people don't have to die horrible deaths on either side. Like human beings, we have not evolved enough out of our ape-like ancestry. Just look at one of those nature shows about the apes and how there was something that my guy was watching the other day, Chimp Nation or something, some chimpanzee documentary on Netflix. Some of you have seen it, and it was getting into how they like to band together and make war on other groups of chimps. And I talked about this also from a philosophical perspective. There was a German philosopher, Hegel, who was really interested in war and conflict. And he believed that human beings actually, that we not only do we have this deep seated, in a way, this desire or drive for conflict, but that we use conflict to achieve unity within our own groups. And that in fact, what we see when we look at history in these horrible cycles of conflict is, from a philosophical perspective, a kind of an evolution of the historical subject of the human species. In that, in fact, these cycles of conflict might be something as brutal and horrible as they are, that in some larger developmental sense we have to go through, we have to get through, just like the lower animal phases of our evolution. And so what I'm saying, again, is not like, oh, well, it sucks, a lot of people are going to die, whatever, what are you going to do? No, it's very tragic, it's very horrible. And if anybody's ever seen a war film, and I'm sure we all have, or a war documentary, it is so disturbing that there are times when faced with this, I mean, it would make one almost suicidal. How could anyone have any sense of any hope for this world or for our purpose here or for humanity when one is faced with repeatedly, day after day, all of these images of horrible things and all of these stories of horrible things? And I am not going to be able to solve that conundrum in this lecture, and nor am I going to try. I did, if you want to check out my philosophy playlist, I did talk in a couple of my videos about suffering and evil and my thoughts on God and spirituality. And so you might find that interesting. Not that I am some sage or have any exclusive knowledge, but you might find it interesting. And you should also check out, if you're interested in this idea of the evolution of the historical subject through conflict that I was talking about, Hegel, I did a video on the Steven Spielberg film Munich, which is an excellent film. There's scenes from it that I show in the video. I think you'll like it a lot. Check that out. I'll put the links to these things below, and they're all in my philosophy playlist. But here's the thing, though, that I want to say, is that this is really the first time that we have had this kind of, that people far removed from such circumstances as the brutality of war and conflict. This is really the first time that so many of us can have such a feeling of immediacy and like you are there, and interacting with people who are there. And so it has an effect, a profound effect in many ways. And so it is I think, a kind of an interesting evolutionary inflection point in our increasingly interdependent relationship with media, and the kind of a transformation that's occurring with us, where we're becoming more and more interconnected, almost like the Borg, Star Trek, if that means anything to you. And I'm not saying that's wholly negative. I'm just thinking it's interesting, and I don't think it's wholly positive either. Pluses and minuses, right? But just thinking about World War II, and I see other people have been having this discussion too online, just thinking about World War II and how, because we were on the side of righteousness, and I think we were. Hitler was terrible. He needed to be dealt with. The Japanese did attack us, and they needed to be dealt with. Yes, like everybody, both sides believed they had their reasons. They had reasons, but I do think that was a situation in history where we were on the righteous side, but we did a hell of a lot of horrible things. And probably I'm not sure if they're all excusable. Who knows if we could have handled things better, you know? We're in a fallen world, so to speak. And like I said, oftentimes we don't have good options. And so I think that it's just really interesting to understand this sort of new facet of this phase that we've entered into. And it does seem to me that both sides in this, the pro-Israeli side and then the pro-Palestinian side, not pro-Hamas, but the pro-Palestinian side I'm talking about, the side that wants Israel to slow it down, calm down, stop it, and then the side of the Israelis, right, which is like, we were attacked, we are in deep shit, and we need to do something about it. But it is interesting to me how both of these sides, there do seem to be narratives that they are sort of intentionally not seeing or not acknowledging in their perspectives, their propaganda. And maybe it's because I'm really wrestling with this still and how I think about it that I'm able to see that. Maybe some of you are as well. But I'll give you an example. You know, it gets into, and I talked about this in my Munich film. Again, check that out, my philosophy Munich war film. But it really gets almost into, it's like a tit for tat, a kind of a back and forth, back and forth. Well, you did this, but I had to do that because you did this. Well, I had to do that because you did this. And so it's almost, you know, when you look at these things, it becomes a challenge to know, like, how far back to recess, so to speak, to regress in one's focus, because it seems like each side is constantly pointing back. You know, so like the Israelis say, we suffered a vicious, horrible terrorist attack several weeks ago. 9/11, like, awful, people burned to death. I mean, the worst things you can imagine, the worst things you can imagine, and totally unprovoked. And so we have to defensively go over to Gaza and deal with the source of that. We cannot be weak. We have to play offensive defense. Just like you Americans did when the Japanese came over and bombed you, and then you unleashed hell on them. Now, that's true. But it doesn't really acknowledge the fact that that many on the other side argue that there was a provocation for those attacks in Israel. And I'm not saying that, I'm not defending that. I'm saying, though, that there are a lot of people arguing the other perspective, which is not that the attacks were in any way justified, but that they were precipitated by all of these horrible things that Israel has done, and basically consciously or unconsciously setting about to make life a living hell for people in Gaza. I saw a prominent journalist today who seems like me to not be firmly in one camp or the other right now. And she was talking about how she was very, very pro-Israel until, I don't know, several months ago. She went to Gaza and she visited there and she saw that it was an absolute hellhole. And she says that the Israelis are at fault in all of these different ways, through all these different mechanisms, all these different rules that they've imposed and restrictions. They have created a hellhole for these people. So these people are living in hell. And so, yes, of course, you would have this small subset of them that would become terrorists and would do horrible things. To which then the other side, I see in the comments, and I was expecting this, it's a very legitimate argument, to which the other side, the pro-Israeli side, said, wait a minute, people in Gaza, the Palestinians have had all of these historical opportunities for a better situation. Way back in 19 whatever, the Israelis offered them all of this land. And they said, no, we want it. We want more. We want more. And they were very unreasonable. There have been all of these times, and I've looked into this. There's truth to it. There have been all of these times where it seems like Israel has made a lot of concessions in attempted diplomatic overtures and attempted peace treaties and so forth. They have offered a lot. And the Palestinian side, or their leaders, just no. And so the Israeli perspective is, there's only so many times that you can keep making concessions, or you can keep trying, when you're just going to finally be like, okay, these people are clearly not interested in peace. And the pro-Israeli side was pointing out that the people in Gaza, that in the mid-2000s, right, the Israelis totally moved out and said, okay, you govern yourselves, and the people in Gaza elected Hamas, and Hamas turned out to be horrible. And they've taken all of this money that they've received that should have gone toward improving the situation in Gaza for the Palestinians, and instead they've funneled it into creating, tunnels and amassing weapons and all of this and training fighters and what have you to wreak mayhem and havoc on their neighbors. To which people say, wait a minute, the average person in Palestine, the average person in Gaza, they didn't vote for Hamas for that reason because they're in favor of this military activity or this terrorist activity. No, Hamas was promising to fix the corruptions of the people who were in power, who were very corrupt in a lot of ways and very problematic. And Hamas came in and as often happens in history, they offered, at least in their rhetoric, they offered something better. Okay, we're going to do this. We're going to pay attention to the needs of the people. We're going to fix this. We're going to solve corruption. We're going to make your situation better. So, in frustration and disgust, people in Palestine, the Palestinians, then they vote in Hamas. And then guess what? And Hamas, for years and years, makes everyone think that they're interested in not in war, but in focusing on making conditions better. And then it turns out they'd been funneling all of this money and all of this attention and this effort into preparing for the horrible terrorist incursions that occurred weeks ago in Israel. To which then someone would say, well, wait a minute, this. To which then someone would say this. And I'm not saying that this sort of infinite game of recessive mirrors, like I've talked about before, like you're in a fun house and it's just, you just can't see the end of it. I'm not saying that that means that both sides are equivocal. So I'm going to continue to look at it, and I'm going to continue to talk about it. And as my opinions, attitudes evolve, I'll share more with you. I had thought about not discussing it at all because I do focus in my channel more on quote unquote domestic issues. But just like everyone else, I'm paying attention, I'm reading, I'm learning, and I'm going to weigh in those ways in which I think I have something legitimate or interesting to say. So if you enjoyed this or got something out of it, I invite you to check out the links below where I have other videos on this topic and on philosophy and so forth. And so I think you'll find it interesting. And as always, I appreciate your support, and I will see you later. Bye.